Hey Art385, this is the software component of our semester. I'm pretty excited about this. Everything realistically in our industry happens through software in some form or fashion nowadays. If you figure out how to earn a living as a graphic designer or typographer without using software, I hope you will clue me in on those secrets because I have not found a way to avoid it. I think there are a lot of core concepts that you can master easily that will allow you to approach any other piece of software and not be terrified of it, of being able to figure out how to get things done, how to accomplish the goals that you're trying to achieve with your design. So I think today we will jump right into talking about Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, and Xd. Those are kind of the four main applications that if you can figure those out, you can really figure a lot of other things out. Some of the animation apps, After Effects and Adobe Animate, some of those are a little bit more advanced, but a lot of the concepts you would learn in Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, and Xd would apply to those apps as well. And I'm going to focus more on the kind of the nuts and bolts of what you're trying to accomplish, because another aspect, we're teaching Adobe software here, obviously, but a lot of these concepts apply to a lot of other different kinds of software. So I think it's really valid to always explore other options. You don't have to get locked into the Adobe ecosystem. Once you're on that roller coaster, it's really hard to get off. By and large, they're great. You know, they're the industry standard. I really don't have a lot of negative things to say about the company other than it's a little pricey. There are options that are a lot more cost effective. So if you're on a budget, the things I'm going to teach you, you would be able to take into other competing applications and still figure out how to accomplish your design. Okay, so let's jump into Photoshop. That's kind of the the big one, the one that everyone wants to learn how to use. I can still remember the first time I saw Photoshop in 1992. That's how much of an impact it made on me. I've been using Photoshop since before layers were available in the program. So I've seen a lot of developments. I've seen a lot of things come and go. But really the core concepts have remained. So there's a few new things that I'll introduce you to, but by and large we'll be covering things that if you can figure this out in Photoshop, you could take them into a lot of other pixel manipulation applications. And so pixels really are the core thing about Photoshop. If you don't know how many pixels you're going to need in your image, that's something you should figure out before you start a file. The reason for that is it's really easy to shrink something in Photoshop, but if you make your image or your file larger, what Photoshop does is it interpolates the pixels in between. So it can sometimes do things you don't want it to by trying to enlarge an image drastically. But all that said, let's dive in and just look at some of the common things you might encounter with Photoshop. So when you first make a new file, it helps if the screen is on the appropriate monitor. You'll be presented with this, where you get a million different presets. They have lots of things for photos. They really try to get you into using these templates. Some of those can be really valid. If you're stuck or you just want to get something done quickly, why not start with one of these, especially if the client doesn't have a lot of money, if you're not getting a lot out of it, if it's a favor for someone. There's really no harm in using these templates. Some of them are really great. There is a marketplace too. If you want to get into template design, you can make your own templates and upload them, and I believe get a commission if people purchase them. So what I tend to do is start with, most of my work's on the web or for screens, so I'll start in this web tab. But really all these do, when you're clicking through here, it's just presets. It's just a way to change this stuff on the right really quickly. So none of these are anything more than just settings. So if you select one, you can always go back and change the parameters on the right. So I'm going to start with the web. We'll just start with a very basic 1920 by 1080, which is regular HD resolution. If you have a regular TV, not a 4K TV, this is the resolution it would use. And so the preset details here tell you the width in pixels, the height. I don't know if there's anyone anymore who uses any of the other measurement options here. Pixels are kind of where it's at. Even if you know approximately the width and height in inches for a print piece, I think a lot of times you want to spec it in pixels so that you know exactly what you're creating. So in this case, we're going to have it 1920 by 1080. If you want to, you can flip the orientation. So let's say you were creating something for a menu display at a restaurant and the television monitor is set up vertically. Maybe you would switch it to that. In this case, we'll just keep it horizontal. The Artboards checkbox, that's a real question for a lot of people. And I go back and forth. Sometimes it is really handy to start out with an artboard. Sometimes I think I don't need an artboard and I will uncheck that, and then inevitably I have to convert everything to artboards later. So I think in general, it's good to just start with an artboard. It's something that doesn't hurt the file. It saves you a step later if you decide you need artboards, and we'll talk about why you might need them. But in general, leave that checked and it's not going to hurt anything. Resolution. Now that's a tricky one. 72 is what I leave everything at. That's just old school screen resolution, right? Even though nowadays resolution is, hundreds of pixels per inch, this is just kind of an old standard. And when you're talking about the width and height of pixels of the image, the resolution really actually doesn't matter. And I'll demonstrate why that is. But the number of pixels in the image is the really critical thing. All the resolution does is says, okay, if I have that many pixels, how many am I squashing into an inch worth of real estate? And that, this is actually more of a relic from print days when a high-res printed piece would have 300 dots per inch. Something low-res like an inkjet printer might have 120 to 150 dots per inch. Sometimes you would have crazy things like really crisp black and white line art that was 1200 dots per inch, but it was only black and white. No shades of gray or anything in between. So you had to have that kind of resolution for smooth lines. So this little dialogue here is kind of an artifact, from older times in graphic design. I recommend, unless you're doing something really specific for a really specific print piece, leave this at 72, and we'll come back to print at a later time. So color mode, this is something that can be confusing at first. It took me a while to figure out color modes when I was starting out. Nowadays, I think it's really easy. Always go RGB. There's no reason to start a file in CMYK. In fact, for some reason, it's not even giving me that option today. So RGB is red, green, and blue. It's based on the light spectrum. CMYK is based on ink. So you probably covered this in your other graphic design classes already. But in case you haven't gotten this information or you're still figuring out how to grasp it, RGB is a much wider color gamut, meaning you can create literally millions more colors in RGB than you can in CMYK. And part of the reason is that light blends much more, in a different fashion than ink. Ink tends to be muddy by nature. It soaks into the material that it's adhered to. So as soon as you convert something from RGB to CMYK, you're essentially throwing out tons of color in order to approximate that in a printed piece. And once you've converted something to CMYK, you can convert it back to RGB, but it's not going to magically get those colors back. You're going to lose a lot of information. So I tend to think of design these days as start in RGB, always work in RGB. It helps things like when you are creating a layered file, the way those layers blend together. If you have it in RGB, you get much better color range. And once you've finished your design, once you're sending it to print, you only convert to CMYK at the very end, at the very last step. And it's just something that once it's in CMYK, you leave it there. You never try to bring it back to RGB. And this is another reason to, and we'll talk about this, always save a layered PSD file as kind of your source image that you would save a copy out of the PSD as a TIFF or a PNG or a JPEG or another format potentially. So bit depth. This is something, by and large, you're always going to stick with 8-bit. But as you move into other, parts of your career in the future, you might start working in 16-bit color. And what this does, it just gives you better blending. Like if you have a very smooth gradient, anyone working in photography, you probably want to stick with 16-bit color. If you're getting into video graphics where you just need amazing, light effects or things where you don't want to see any banding of colors, go with 16-bit. The drawback is the files double in size. They get much bigger. Storage is pretty cheap these days, so it's not that much of an issue, but it is something to be aware of that if you don't need 16-bit, don't use it. But if it's something where you absolutely need the most beautiful, pristine source image, go with 16-bit. But be mindful of, if you're just pulling images off the web, a lot of those are going to be 8-bit anyway. So unless you know you're working with really beautiful 16-bit source material, sometimes it's best just to stick in 8-bit because the files are smaller. For things on the web, most people can't tell the difference. A lot of stuff gets saved down to what they call sRGB, which is a color standard on the web, so it throws away a lot of color anyway. So in general, 16-bit is only for really specialized applications, but you may run into it. 32-bit is something I've never really had the need to use 32-bit ever. But there are applications where, if you're making a 4K Avengers movie, you're going to be working in 32-bit. You're going to want to have every bit of color you can possibly imagine in there. But that's really outside the scope of what we're talking about. So moving on, background contents. I tend to always stick with transparent because you just never know what your background might end up being. If you're creating graphics for the web, you're going to want them to float on other colors. If you do need a background color burned in, you can always add that later in Photoshop. So I tend to always start with transparent. And then down here with the advanced options, this, I'm going to sort of gloss over this because this can make things really confusing at this stage. But in general, you either want to say don't color manage, or just stick with working RGB, which should be set to sRGB. It's the most standard kind of color model, color profile. And what that does, it just helps your image look the same, whether it's on a Macintosh, on a Windows machine, on an iPhone, on an Android phone. sRGB is just kind of like widely adopted. If you do get into more specialized color development, there's a million other things here that come into play. But yeah, I think if you need these, you'll know it. So if you're ever wondering what should I do here, just stick with sRGB. It tends to work for everything. If you're needing a little bit more, color range or something where you're working with more professional color, ProPhoto is a good one. But in general, unless someone is telling you specifically to use something different here, just stick with sRGB or say don't color manage, which won't mess with any of your colors. And then the last thing here is your pixel aspect ratio. It's 2022. All of these are from a long time ago. You really never need to deal with this anymore. If you do need to deal with these other aspect ratios, someone will tell you, whoever your client is, they will mention that you have to work in this. But by and large, keep everything square pixels these days, and those other aspect ratios come toward the end of the process if you're working with video in particular. Okay, we are here in Photoshop. We can go over a few just basic things about Photoshop. You probably have already been introduced to some of these, and then we'll focus more on some of the type aspects. But don't worry if something isn't covered here. We have plenty of time. We can get into the nitty-gritty, or if you have specific questions, we can address those. And I really want this to be a group where we can share different problems we've encountered and share how we've figured out solutions to those problems, because that's really the key to success in this industry, in my opinion, is just getting past the hurdles. There's always going to be something you don't expect, and you don't let it stop the whole process. You just keep going and figure out ways around it, and that's really the secret. So within Photoshop, there's a couple things you want to do right away. There's a few things here that are kind of red flags that making my skin crawl, just something you need to address immediately. Number one, this says Untitled 1. That is just, don't ever use the word untitled. It is the worst name for a file you can possibly imagine. If you see that, develop the instinct to destroy an unsaved file. Make it saved, make it beautiful, make it permanent. So quick save as. We will just call this the really descriptive name of Photoshop demo. Doesn't matter what your name is, just name it something so that you can come back to it and remember what the heck it was you were trying to do. In this case, I'm going to embed the color profile because sRGB is a really common one for the web, and it really doesn't hurt anything at this point to embed that profile. Next thing, so now I can see it's saved as Photoshop demo. This makes it much easier as I make changes to just do a file save really quick. Next thing I want to do is name this artboard because I chose to have this document started with artboards. Just going to call this PS_demo. And I'm using the underscore here. You don't have to, but in this case, I'm imagining I'm probably going to save this for the web at some point. So I'm not using spaces. Realistically, maybe I want to avoid capital letters as well. You know, it really depends on who you're working with and what your process is, but it's just sort of a habit. I use underscores instead of spaces. Not essential anymore, but if you notice me doing that, it's just habit, really. In this case, let's start with just some of the adjustment layers. So a lot of times you're going to want some kind of background color. Even if you end up saving the image as a transparent image, you want a background color just so you kind of know, you know, how the content you're creating looks with a solid background. So this little half moon shape here is for your adjustment layers. These are really handy. Solid color will just keep a color fill like washed across the entire canvas. And it's really easy to, good morning. It's really easy to change the colors as well. So I tend to, instead of using the paint bucket tool, where if you wanted to change colors, that can present some problems down the road if you don't get it exactly aligned to the edges, using the color fill just takes care of all of that. So in this case, I'm going to use this beautiful French fuchsia color here. Let's make it really saturated. Hit OK. And now the nice thing is, if you accidentally click on that and drag it, it's not moving at all. Even though technically this layer is moving, because it fills the entire layer, it's not going to accidentally have just like a little sliver of a pixel on the edge or something like that. So in addition to the adjustment layers, you have just regular pixel layers. This might be where you place a photograph or import, you know, an image from the web. It might be something where if you're using a tablet to draw, you could paint directly with this. In this case, I'm just going to make a very basic, beautiful spiral. I'm going to immediately name the layer spiral. And that's just, if I can stress anything in this class, get in the habit of naming your layers immediately after you create them. It really is like giving a gift to your future self, because there are going to be times you'll come back to a file. It's got hundreds of layers. You can't remember why you put them there or what they do. Just go ahead and name it. It really doesn't take that much time. It's one of the best habits you can get into working with software. Going to also create a text layer on top of this. First, I'm going to just reduce the opacity of this so I can see a little better. And you probably know how to do that with the slider here. So if you want it to just barely be visible. But what some people don't know is you can just hit the number keys. So if I wanted this to be 50% transparent, I would just hit the 5 key. If I wanted to go to 90, I would hit the 9 key. If I want to go to 10, I hit the 10 key. And sometimes that can be handy. You can just sort of cycle through them to see where you want to land. And that's a really, I don't know, I use that every single time I open Photoshop. So to add type, the shortcut, you can either just click the type tool here, or you can just hit the T key, and that will select it automatically. Once I have that selected, I can either just click once and start typing. That will create what's called point type. What that means is there's no bounding box on the type. So it will just run off the edge of the document. There's nothing holding this type back. Point type is like the freest type in the entire universe. I'm going to click. Actually, I'm just going to stick with lorem ipsum on this just for example. And so you can see that because it's point type, when I drag it, there's really no bounding box to it. If I added more text to it, you can see the point here in the center. But the type will just keep flowing. It won't actually wrap to another line until I tell it to explicitly. So I'm going to name this layer point type. All right, so that's in contrast to area type. So the way to get area type is you just click and drag. Now in this case, because I clicked on something that wasn't a type layer, Photoshop automatically created the type layer. If you want to be really explicit, you can also click to add a new blank layer and then also click and drag on that. It's kind of like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. They both work. They both will get you a new type layer. So immediately Photoshop comes up with the last settings I had for the type. Kind of a pain in my opinion, but that's just what it does. I believe there's a preference to change that if it's something that causes a lot of hassle for you. In this case, I just want to make it smaller. So I can either use the menu on the type properties here. I can use the menu up here in this bar. I like to say there's 9 ways to skin a cat in Photoshop with everything you do. There's really no best way. It's whatever is fastest, what saves you the most time. But I truly believe however it gets done is how it gets done. So don't stress about, am I doing this the right way? Just look for clues that maybe you're trying to do something and it feels like it's taking longer than it should. That might be a signal to try investigate a way to do something faster. So in this case, I want to show you a shortcut if you don't know this. If you hold down Command, Shift, and then use the left and right bracket keys, that can shrink type. And if I just hold down the the less than sign, not bracket, you can see it's automatically just reducing that font for me. So again, Command Shift greater than sign will bring type up, or I guess Command Shift period. Command Shift less than or comma will bring type down. That's beautiful. So here I'll show you a few other shortcuts for working with type in Photoshop. If you want to left align this, your alignment is up here. But again, it's also over here in this. I'll expand this out so we can see it a little better. Your alignment is here in the Properties palette. You can also use the key commands. Command Shift L will left align, doesn't change anything. Command Shift R will right align. Command Shift C will center align. So those are some shortcuts for you. And those work pretty much in all the Adobe applications. So in this case, I want it left. I'll keep it that way. I personally don't like hyphenation in a design. To me, hyphenation really only belongs in newspapers and magazines, anywhere where you have so much text that you're working with that the hyphens aren't going to distract from the message. But in a one-page design or something that's simpler, hyphenation really doesn't serve a lot of purpose. So I tend to just turn it off. And you can do that here under, it's hidden because Adobe likes to make everything really obvious. So under the paragraph section of the Properties palette here, just click this little dealio, this little ellipsis, and that will expand more options. And here you can uncheck that to remove the hyphenation. And the last thing is this is maybe tracked out a little bit further than I would like. Again, we're not focusing on making this design look good. I'm just showing some of the core features of type here. So you can either go here to this tracking value and set that to a negative number to bring it closer together. Or a keyboard shortcut is if you take your type and hit Option arrow. So I'm hitting the right arrow, that's going to track it out, and you can see the value over here getting bigger as I do that. Or Option left, we'll bring it back in. You want to be careful though, this tends to be unreadable, so keep it within reason unless you have a really compelling reason in your design to do that. And I wanted to point out what I'm doing right now is called tracking, which tracking is kerning across a big range of type. Kerning is just between 2 letters. So I'm going to zoom into 2 that I maybe could fix here. That between the A and the M seems like that space is a little large. So that is when I can either go to this kerning here and bring that in a little bit. And you can tell by the icon, see how it's showing the kerning slash between 2 letters, but here it's showing those letters selected. You can also click on this and just drag, although it's not doing it in real time for some reason. Or, again, with the key command, just hold down Option and hit the left arrow key to bring that closer. And I think that looks pretty good. Sometimes it comes down to personal taste, but in general, you want to just make it visually look appealing. All right, so that is kerning and tracking. There are a few other ways. You can set this just to optical, where it will use some sort of behind the scenes algorithms to make it look really nice. I tend to like optical. I think it works pretty well. Metrics uses data that's already embedded into the font. So if you have a font you paid a lot of money for, you're probably going to want to use the metrics because that's already been considered. It's already part of the font design itself. And the last thing we'll talk about with Photoshop type today is the sort of anti-aliasing algorithm. So when I have this layer selected, what I can do is go up to here in the character palette of the properties, they again have an ellipsis. So I will drop that down. And then here where it says sharp, you get a lot of different options here. By and large, you want either sharp or crisp. And in this case, you can't see it too much because it's really subtle on this font. But as I change this, you can see, well, actually, I'm lying to you. If I say strong, there we go. So now you can sort of see how those edges change. And this is something, if you're ever setting type in Photoshop and it just doesn't look right, sometimes you can change this anti-aliasing and it will just fix things. Sometimes it's off by default and that looks really ugly. You can see there's no anti-aliasing. But in this case, I'm going to leave this on crisp, which tends to be what I use most of the time, and it seems like it works for just about every application. So again, those are kind of the core concepts of type in Photoshop. What you're looking at here, this would be about as much type as I would ever set in Photoshop. If you're needing something with like dozens of paragraphs or multiple pages, you're going to want to look at using a different application, which coincidentally brings us to the next application. We'll look at Adobe Illustrator. We are jumping into Illustrator now, and the primary difference with Illustrator is it is about creating vector illustrations or vector graphics. If you don't know the difference between vector and pixel, pixel is a grid of squares, multicolored squares, and vectors are lines and shapes that are described mathematically. So if you remember studying curves and geometry, things like that, that is what vector art does. And the result is that pixel graphics, if you try to scale them up, the software has to sort of guess what those pixels are in between the small state and the larger state. With vector art, it is described mathematically, so you can scale it up almost infinitely, really. And it's going to keep the shape and resolution of your artwork. So vector files are used a lot for logos, are used a lot for type illustrations, anything where you want to be able to hold on to that resolution, scale something up and down. Typically, Illustrator, in my experience, is used more for kind of the basis of a design. There are some amazing illustrators who work completely in Illustrator and everything start to finish is done in that program. But in my experience, it's usually a smaller component that then is brought into InDesign or maybe enhanced in Photoshop, or maybe it's brought into After Effects and animated. So there's a lot of flexibility with Illustrator. So jumping right into the new file screen, very much like Photoshop, you have a lot of presets, things that are already sort of described in really common language or common numbers, I guess. So in this case, I'm going to stick again with web, and we'll just do the same thing we did in Photoshop. Do a web large, so 1920 by 1080, so standard HD resolution. And you'll notice a lot of this stuff looks really similar. There's a few differences that we'll cover, but I want to start really emphasizing that you can traditionally make the same result, the same design in all of these applications. So you could do something in Illustrator that you could also do in Photoshop, that you could also do in InDesign, that you also could do in Adobe Xd. A lot of the features evolve through time in a way that the programs used to be more specialized, and then they started to incorporate different features of other applications within the whole formerly Creative Suite, now Creative Cloud. So that is to say that if you find yourself really struggling with like which application should I be using right now, as long as you can get the job done, it kind of doesn't matter. Just do what's best, what saves you the most time, and what will help your final output be exactly what it needs to be. So in this case, we have width and height. It's set in pixels here. It has a lot of other options here. So this might be a case, since Illustrator tends to lend itself more to print design if needed. You might spec something in inches here. If you're doing a massive banner, maybe you do feet. But in general, I tend to stick with pixels because most of the stuff I do is for the web. But just know that these other options are here as well. Picas, we'll cover that later, but that's if you're in newspaper or magazine design, that's really all that you would use picas for. Artboards, so Illustrator by default makes you put an artboard on the canvas. Photoshop doesn't do that. Illustrator requires it, so we'll just leave one artboard there. The orientation, if you needed to flip it portrait or horizontal or landscape, that's what that is for. Bleed is sometimes you'll have a print piece and you want that ink to go all the way off the edge. And so when you spec an amount of bleed here, that's what that is for. Later on in the print process, you would specify where those crop marks are for the blades to cut. But sometimes, usually it's around 1/8 of an inch or like 9 pixels. Really though, for print, you wouldn't be using pixels, so I'm contradicting myself there. But the rest of this stuff is the same as we saw in Photoshop. You've got your color mode. Again, I recommend stay in RGB until you absolutely need to not be in RGB. It's really rare these days that you would need to get really precise with CMYK inks right off the bat. Used to be more common maybe 20 years ago, but nowadays I just recommend stay in RGB because you can always convert it to CMYK later. It's really trivial to do that. Acrobat PDF software does it automatically for you. Raster Effects. This is one thing that is a bit different than Photoshop. So you can make designs in Illustrator that then are converted into pixels. And so when it does the calculations to convert something, let's say it's as simple as a drop shadow. This raster effect resolution is how many pixels per inch that effect will be converted to. So in general, if it's something that's just going to go on the web, leave it at 72. If it's something that is for print, go 300. And if you just don't know, leave it at 300, because converting things to raster effects is not a super common thing you might do in Illustrator. It's definitely helpful. There are definitely uses for it. But if you're not sure, just stick with high raster effect setting. That's something, because you have the original vector art to go back to, you can always redo this later, so it's not super critical. And then preview mode, this is something that you really only would do overprint if you're doing a print piece. It can simulate how those inks kind of look in the real world. That gets a lot more specialized, and I don't know if you necessarily run into that unless you're doing some really specialized, like high quality offset printing. So in general, just leave the preview mode to pixel or default. All right, we'll go ahead and create our document. So you can see the interface is similar to Photoshop. We've got layers here, actions, appearance, all this stuff is more custom to Illustrator itself. For the moment, we're just going to focus on the layers and the artboards, just to go over kind of how you do things in Illustrator similar to the way we did it in Photoshop. So right off the bat, make sure we save. I'll show you a shortcut here, at least on Mac OS. I don't know if this works on Windows, but because I want to call this something similar, I'm just going to click on this title down here, the Photoshop demo. And you see how when I clicked on it, it automatically added that to the file name. A lot of times you might want the same prefix in your files and just have the, the individual application suffix at the end. In this case, I'm going to rename that to Illustrator. And format, most of the time, keep it in .ai. Only go down to these when you know you need to, and we'll cover that later. But for the moment, keep everything as .ai. Now for version, this is something, always keep it in the latest version while you're working on it. But you may run into cases where you need to save this down to an older version, like some 3D software only will use Illustrator 8 format. So there are use cases for saving something back, but if it's just your computer, keep it on the latest version. And if you are short on file space on your hard drive, you can uncheck create PDF compatible file. That'll save some room. I don't think that's really ever an issue, in modern times, but it used to be that saving this option would add a ton of file size. And then these are just the color profiles. So usually sRGB gets saved in there. Usually these are just checked by default. You can just leave them and not worry about it. And compression will just sort of like help that Illustrator file be a little bit smaller on your hard drive. All right, so now we're saved there. Same thing, I'm going to rename the artboard to AI demo, just to give that a name. So Illustrator doesn't have some of the adjustment layer helper things that Photoshop does. So in this case, if you want to make background color, you're gonna have to draw that yourself. So I'm going to choose just another really garish kind of fuchsia And this isn't to look good, it's just to sort of demo what these things are about. And again, I want to just name my layers right away, so background. Now, Illustrator makes things a little confusing because each layer has sublayers. So you see when I drop that down, it shows the rectangle. If I were to put more elements on here, I'll do an ellipse. Just make these some other ugly colors. What else? We'll do type in a second. If I just want to do a path like this. Oops. There we go. And so path options, you're probably aware you can increase the size of that. But once I have a few elements, you can see those are all listed here as sublayers in this main layer. And sometimes that can get a little confusing, but it is also a really powerful feature. If you have a really complex illustration, I do recommend, not for something like this, I wouldn't probably rename these sublayers, but if I was working on something like a map or something really intricate, I would take the time to go through it and rename these sublayers to be a little bit more helpful. But in this case, what I'm going to do is just move these elements to layers above. So we'll call this ellipse and path. And this is a really handy way to move things around. So you could just cut and paste. So I would select it here, move to this layer, and then paste. When you do that, though, you want to make sure that you click this little circle. That means it's going to target that layer. So I'm going to cut it, target that layer, and then paste. Oh, and that actually didn't work. There we go. I had to make sure to select the layer as well. Another way to do that, however, is there's this little tiny square that you can click on that while this is selected and just drag it up like that. And that automatically moved it to that layer. So I'll do the same thing here where I can click that and drag it up. And sometimes that can be really handy if you've got, 100 layers and you're just trying to move things around efficiently. Just know it's kind of a little proxy icon that you can click on something and move it around. So I'll do that with the background just for example. But you can see that move the background up to that path layer. I can move it right back down. And again, in all these, they still have a sublayer. So now those sublayers, though, have just been moved up into the main layers. And I recommend use as many layers as you need to. They're cheap, they don't cost you anything, and it can really, really help organize your file. So I'm going to reduce the opacity of these. I'm going to actually take the line off of the circle here. And the shortcut I'm using, I'm hitting the X key, which swaps the fill and the stroke in these little chips down here, and then just clicking to set that to nothing. So with those selected, in Illustrator, to change transparency, you use this tool over here, and you can drag that down like that. You can also set the blending modes like Photoshop. The thing to be aware of is this starts to take it out of pure vector mode. And there are cases where this may not, if you send this to another application, sometimes it could adjust the colors in ways that you're maybe not happy with. For the most part it works, but it is something to be aware of, that blend modes in Illustrator, especially when printing. Like for screen, they usually work great, but when you're printing things, I have seen cases where sometimes it just doesn't do what you were hoping it would with the colors. That might be a reason to take it into Photoshop if you're starting to experience like some output issues with that. All right, so I'm gonna make that beautiful design a little bit less transparent, more transparent, less opaque. All right, and in this case, using the type tool won't create an extra layer for you automatically. So in Illustrator, we have to make our own layer. But the way that the type actually works is very similar to Photoshop. I can click just once. And I spelled that wrong. But this is now point type. So you can see there's no bounding box, it just has the little point of registration there. So I'm going to center that. I'm using the keyboard shortcuts, Command-Shift-C to center, Command-Shift-R to right align, Command-Shift-L to left align. So those are all the same between Photoshop and Illustrator and all the other Adobe applications. Let's use a slightly better font. Again, this is not about making this look good just yet. It's just really sort of introducing the concepts here. In Illustrator, so you can use the same Command-Shift greater than and less than to increase the font size. You can also use the character palette. You can update it there. And you can also use, there's the tab bar up at the top here that you can get to some of that stuff more quickly. So that is point text. Similar thing, I'm going to make a new layer, so I'll show you here. If I just click and drag, oops, sorry, I selected that by mistake. If I click and drag with the type tool, forgive me, I am accidentally hitting the text up above. There we go. So you can see it fills it with some placeholder text automatically. I'm going to just reduce that down quickly. And you can actually, in Illustrator, fill it with placeholder text. That's under the Type menu. And so this can be handy if you don't exactly know what the text is supposed to say, but your client has asked you to figure out what it's going to look like. So again, by default, it's going to add a hyphenation. So I'm going to select that and go to Paragraph and just uncheck hyphenate. And if these palettes aren't showing, what you can do is go to the Window menu, and all of these are going to be down here under Type. So you've got Character, Paragraph, those are your most common elements that you would use. And because I made this area type, you can see I can change the width of this bounding box and reflow the type. So that's the major difference. You have to be careful though, because it is possible to skew it, oops, by accident. Something like this. Usually you don't want that, but it can be handy if sometimes you want, you know, your type to be shaped in a certain way. So since I put that on the same layer, I'm going to call this one point text. And I'll make a new layer and call this area text. And the same thing we talked about just a minute ago, if you select this, you can see there's a little icon here, a proxy icon. I can just drag that up and it will move it to that layer. And I really recommend the more layers you put in, the better. It doesn't cost you anything, and it just makes it much easier to move things around. You can lock certain layers, turn certain layers off. Just really handy versus putting everything on one layer, which can kind of become a mess. So I wanted to talk about two other things that Illustrator does well. These are available in Photoshop, but they're a little bit more focused on Illustrator. The first is being able to convert type to outlines. So with the text selected, you just go Type, Convert to Outline, or Create Outline, sorry. And what that does is turns it into just vector art. There's no way to change the type at this point. It's just going to be vectors. Another thing, and then, sorry, to jump back quickly, once you have it in this state, you can do all sorts of things. You know, a lot of these you're able to do with just the type itself. But should you want to do something crazy like add an effect, you can, distort's always fun. You can tweak it, where you can really like make the letters pretty crazy. Sometimes that's interesting to get really weird effects. Or if you need to do some minor adjustments, let's say you wanted this, for whatever reason, the dot on this eye to be like a balloon. Oops. You can do that. So converting to outlines just lets you get right into the points. But remember, once you do that, there's no going back. You can't edit this text again. It's just going to say what it's going to say. I also wanted to talk just really quickly about the Glyphs Palette, which is a way that you can access other characters that are in a font that might not be visible initially. So the Glyphs Palette will show you every character that's in the font. When we get to the creating a typeface assignment, this will be really handy to see the sorts of different ligatures and accident characters and things that are available. So in this case, let's say you wanted to do something like you needed to do a very certain ligature. So what you can do is just go to your standard ligatures palette here, and then all of these are available. So all you do is just double click, and it will add that character in. And some fonts, this is not a font that does that at the moment, but some will have alternate characters. So let's say you're doing a logo type and you have two capital letters that are the same letter, but you want them to look slightly different. There are certain fonts that will actually have alternates of that you can just add a little bit more finesse, a little bit more variety to your design. So we will come back to Illustrator to look at some of the other aspects of it that lets you do larger columns of type and maybe flow type between different artboards. But by and large, Illustrator is a program that you're just going to be using type on one artboard. Smaller amounts of type. You really don't want to be messing with large amounts of type in Illustrator. Okay, so we are cruising through these applications. You probably can just feel like the design power coursing through your veins already. Wanted to jump into Indesign. Now this is a program that is really for heavy-duty document construction. Definitely possible to make a flyer. I would say it competes with Illustrator on that level. But the real power of Indesign is making multi-page documents, anything from 2 pages to 2,000 or plus pages. There actually is an application for, if you're thinking of like massive manuals, thousands of pages, that's called FrameMaker. That's a whole, you could just get a degree just in FrameMaker if you wanted to. But for things like annual reports, maybe like a guidelines document for a client's branding, anything that just needs multiple pages and the ability to flow text from one page to the other, InDesign is going to be the app that you want to use. So starting a file in InDesign, very similar to other Adobe apps, if I can get this on the correct screen. So it's even more important though to know what your document size is, because changing midstream here can really be a chore. There are some tools to sort of optimize that, but for the most part, once you make a document in InDesign, try not to change anything about the overall size of it, whether or not the pages are facing or not, that sort of idea. So your details here, it defaults to picas typically. Here in the States, you might want to go more with inches. This is a legal size document, maybe more like a letter size that is 8.5 by 11 is something a little bit more familiar. We'll go ahead and make this landscape as well, just since we're doing landscape for all the other ones today. Your pages, let's go ahead and make this 3 pages. Well, if I could type the right number, 3 pages. Facing pages, now that is something that you really only need if you are creating a book, something that will be bound, something that will be professionally produced. For the most part, facing pages is not something that you would really worry about if you're just going to laser print a document. Usually in that case, every page is about the, set up the same. Facing pages is good for if you have a book that opens up and you need the center margin to be slightly wider. If you need to account for the physical dimensions of the hundreds of pages of the book, that's a factor in how things are printed. That's when you would use facing pages. So if it's something more digital, something only for the screen that you might just page through page by page in a PDF, you do not need facing pages. So in this case, I'm going to keep that unchecked. We will come back to that though, so you can see how that works later. But today we're just going to keep it simple. If you need to, you can start page numbers at a different number. This is if you're working on a large publication and maybe different designers are working on different chapters. That might be something where you start the page number at something other than 1. We will go ahead and add 3 columns today. So columns is a great thing that's built into InDesign that's not really available in the other applications. It's definitely possible to do columns in Photoshop and Illustrator, but they're not designed for that. The apps really do different things. So if you need columns, definitely go with InDesign. I'm going to go ahead and make these 1/2 inch in between columns. The margins of the whole document I'm going to also leave at 1/2 inch. Bleed and slug, these are again for when you're definitely going to have this printed at a professional printing establishment. These are elements that you would need. Not so common anymore. Even if you are getting it printed, the budget to add bleed to a document is sometimes just non-existent. By adding that, it adds all these other complications of needing to trim off the edges of the book or the document. So for the most part, you probably aren't going to need bleed for a lot of the things you would do. But that's what it's for, is if you need the ink to actually bleed off the edge of the page. So once you have all of those things set, go ahead and create. Get a little beach ball action. Maybe a lot of beach ball action. I can still remember in 2002 when the beach ball icon was changed from its more primitive state to a shinier state. I'm really just killing time. I don't know why this is taking so long. But this is a reason that you pay Adobe so much money, is to watch the beach ball on occasion. Okay, now that we're in, same thing. If you see the word untitled, it should be a red flag. Something is not right in the universe. Make sure to save as quickly as possible. So I'll go ahead and get back to demo files. We'll call this InDesign demo. Just as an aside, but if you're putting InDesign as a skill on your resume, make sure to spell it correctly, and that is using the capital D. That's something I've noticed a lot, that people would capitalize the S in Photoshop, even though it doesn't use that, or not capitalize the D in InDesign. It's really trivial, doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of the universe, but if you're applying somewhere, they're going to want to know you pay attention to details. And so I always say, just look at what the titles are on your computer and make sure you copy that exactly. All right, now that that's set up, we'll go ahead and make some text. First, I'm just going to make a headline, something large. InDesign does not let you do point type. So I'm clicking just once here, it's not doing anything. I have to draw a text box. Everything in Illustrator is area type. So in this case, I'm going to rename layer 1 to headline. Use our famous lorem ipsum, doing Command Shift greater than or Command Shift period to make that larger. And that shortcut works in just about every Adobe app, so that's a good one to know if you don't know it already. I think this one we're just going to go minion. We're just going to keep this super basic. Now that I have this, all the same sorts of ideas apply. I could make it right aligned by hitting Command Shift R, center by Command Shift C, or Command Shift L to left align it. If you wanted to, you could convert that to outlines by saying create outlines. And then this again, it's harder to see in InDesign, but they are actually outlines. I'm going to undo that because for the most part, you only convert to outlines for very specific reasons. You don't want to just do it willy-nilly because you lose the ability to edit that type later. You can also, just like Illustrator or Photoshop, we didn't really get into this, but you can rotate any type. InDesign, for the most part, has the most type capabilities. This app was built just around managing large amounts of type. So I am going to create text blocks. So I just typed something in just so I could see it to get started. But while that's selected, I'm going to fill that with placeholder text using type fill with placeholder text. And so this is great just to get something out there. So now that that's filled, what I can do is there's this little box down here that this allows me to continue that type in another column. So I'm going to shrink this up just so it's a little bit easier to see, but it's that little red plus right here. And if I click that, you can see it turns into a whole different icon. And now because I have columns defined, I could just click and it will fill this column with a box. I could also click and drag to make a different size box if I need to. So I'll show you both. I'll just click, you can see that filled that. And it just starts wherever you clicked and it takes it all the way to the bottom margin. But I'll hit undo. I could also, if I needed that to be a whole different shape like this for some reason, I could click and drag. But for the most part, a lot of times what you'll do is be clicking and click all the way through however many columns you have. So because this text ends here, this is blank now down here. You can still, however, click to continue that series of columns. So I'm going to click and again, click and drag. So even though it's empty, the great part is if I were to copy that, I'm just going to paste a lot more text. You can see it automatically flows to that next column. And this is really, really, really handy. InDesign, if you're ever needing to stretch text across multiple columns or multiple pages, you should probably be in InDesign. Like I said, it's possible to do this with Illustrator artboards and Photoshop artboards. It's not common, and if you find yourself doing lots of type in Illustrator or Photoshop, it's kind of important to ask yourself why. Why is this happening? Because it's not normal. No offense, but it's not normal. But there could be a reason. I mean, anything's possible. Maybe you don't have access to those other apps or something like that. Not as common these days with Creative Cloud, but there it is. So I'm going to go ahead and try to balance these columns a little bit. So again, this is totally ugly, but that is not the point. So once these are created, I want to put these on their own layer as well. So same way, just make a new layer. We'll call this body text. And then if I select those, very similar to Illustrator, I can either just cut, click on this layer, oops, and paste. But you see how they didn't go in the same spot? So you might want to do edit, paste in place, and that will remember where they were. Or what I like to do, because it's a little more visual, is just click that little icon and drag it down, and then that will move it. And it's a little easier to see in this app, but you can see how these have red outlines now. That's because the color of this layer is red. So if I double clicked on this layer, I could make the color of it green. And now you'll see those outlines turn to green. This is just for your sake. It's just because sometimes you'll get a document that's so complicated, you need to sort of know what layer something is on visually. Those guides don't print. They don't show up anywhere else except when you're developing in InDesign. One thing you want to avoid when you have this much type, you could say type create outlines. And you can see there a little more easily with the green outline. But there's really no point to doing that. I have seen it in the past where maybe you're sending it to a printer who might not have the fonts you need, but in the modern age of PDF, there's really no reason to ever convert that much type to outlines. So I just wanted to show quickly how you might then extend this to other pages. So you could do the same thing. You can click that continuation icon, click here, and it will fill that column. So I'm just going to do this for all these columns, and then I will paste more text in. And again, this isn't about looking good at this point. This is just to show how some of this works. And then I will select all the type and just paste it in. And so that way you can see that all of that type just flows. And a good way to visualize that is under the View menu, you can actually say Extras, Show Text Threads, and you see here it shows you where everything is connected. And that can be really, really handy when you have, dozens of pages and you're not quite sure, maybe the layout's a little funky and you're not quite sure what goes to what. But that's a really, really handy way of doing that. Okay, so last thing to talk about with InDesign are styles or style sheets. These are really powerful, something that InDesign does better than just about any other application. Like, you can get into nuances you wouldn't believe with their style sheets. And for any document more than a page or two, I think it's absolutely essential. It will, even if you never change anything about your document, just setting it up, getting in the habit of using style sheets will make your life so much easier. And should you need to change something, style sheets make it really, 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 really easy to do that. So to get your style sheets out, you go to Window, Styles, and you can see there's a bunch of other types of styles. There's tables and objects. Today we're just going to talk about character and paragraph. And so these on mine are stuck up in this little area of the UI. So character styles only affect the letters. Paragraph styles affect the entire paragraph. And it can be a confusing difference, but if you think about, you might have a paragraph that needs to have space above or below. The character styles really only change like the font and the font size, the font color, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to hit to make a new style here, call this headline. And then under basic character formats, let's just pick something totally ugly. Impact, my favorite font in the entire universe. Let's make that really big and chunky and hit OK. And then now that I have that created, I just have to click on my text box and then click on that. Boom, and it changes it. So now that that's been identified as a headline, let's say your client comes back and they don't know what's cool. They're like, oh man, impact, that's not really on brand for us. And you're like, well, okay, it's your choice, you're paying me. All you have to do, double click the headline style, go back to your basic character formats, and pick something that they might like better, like Arial, another really amazing font, a really hard-working, heavy-duty kind of font. There we go. So now your client's happy. Totally kidding, by the way. These are hilariously ugly fonts, so don't take me seriously. When you work with paragraphs, it's kind of a different beast. So let's make a body text style. And in a large document, I'm just in the habit of calling it body text. I learned that in newspaper class a million years ago, but you can just call it text. You can call it whatever you like. But body text for me is just what the body of the document is all about. So again, you can specify, the character formats here if you need to. So in this case, we don't want this to be Arial, 48 point. Let's make this more like 12 point, something normal. Leading we'll talk about more in another lecture, but the space between lines, if you wanted it a little bit bigger, maybe we could go to like 15. And then currently in all of our paragraphs here, there isn't a space between paragraphs automatically. So when you first start out, it's really natural to just hit returns to add space. But as you're doing more professional typography, you want to start doing things like adding paragraph spacing explicitly with paragraph styles. And you can see there's a ton of categories here. We're going to get into all of these. So get ready to really get advanced with typography as we get through the semester. You will know how to use all of this stuff, and it will change your life. It will make you highly employable, at least in my opinion. So paragraph, or indents and spacing, sorry, that's what I'm after. For this one, we're just going to add a first line indent, kind of old school. We'll just make it go in maybe 1/4 inch. And then we will add a space after each paragraph about, let's do 1/8 of an inch. Hit OK. So now if I select my text box and hit body text, nothing happens. Why is that? Excellent question. It's because I have to select everything manually and then convert it. So you can see as soon as I did that, now it's all defined as body text. If I were to add a return, you can see it automatically adds the attributes. We have an indent and we have a space in between. So that can be really, really helpful when you have a lot of text to work with. So let's say your client comes back and says, well, actually, we cut the budget. We can't print as many pages. We need to reduce pages. Sometimes that's a nightmare. When you have style sheets set up, simple as double clicking here, go in your basic formats, and maybe we reduce the font size down, and you can actually preview it without leaving this document. So I can say, well, what if we go to 9 point? And then we bring our leading up a little bit. And so you can see once you have things defined in style sheets, it makes it so much easier to change this entire document. So that's something I'm really going to emphasize in this class is if you're doing a document in InDesign, always worth it to spend the time to set up the style sheets properly. It will just save you so much time in the long run and give you a lot of flexibility and help you make a better design, honestly, with your document. Hello, hello. We are back. We are now moving on to the last application of the day, Adobe Xd. And this is the newest app from Adobe. I personally really like it. It's very modernized. It does a lot of what Illustrator and maybe InDesign do. It's great for just rapidly getting something together. If it's destined for the screen, if it's mostly just kind of type and layout based, you're not doing a lot of intricate illustration, Xd can be a really quick thing to open up and just get a design out there. So I wanted to, in this one, I'm going to actually show you a working document in the interest of, just showing you some real world stuff too. And I wanted to show you something we've recently been working on. I believe I gave you an overview a while ago of, we're taking videos that we are converting from a video format, MP4, over to Adobe Animate. And some of that involved simplifying what was going on in the video. And in this case, we had to present storyboards telling the client how we were going to do that and what the end result was going to be. And this is a great way to sort of introduce what Xd does really well, in my opinion. So Xd is not necessarily something you would be making a print document with. It's possible, not really common. You could use Xd to make things like banner ads or social media graphics. It's really powerful in prototyping UI, UX design. So if you actually want to show the flow of an app and how it moves from screen to screen, it's great for that. There's a lot of features built in where you can sort of simulate interactivity or animation. In this case today, we're just going to look at the type features and the basic artboard features. So in this case, I've set up a bunch of artboards that are all the same size. These are all just HD resolution 1920 by 1080. So in this case, this is for a new product called Creative Cloud Express. I believe I was telling you that this is the product that's going to take all of our jobs eventually, but it's better to be aware of it and figure out how to adapt and use it. So in this case, each artboard represents one of the storyboards for one of the final videos. And as you can see, all 8 of them that we're doing can be in one document. And it's really pretty limitless. It's more about the memory you have on your computer. But you can see the canvas in Xd is massive. I've seen, dozens of artboards in some files. In this case, we just have 8. And each one of these is over here when you don't have anything selected. This little blue icon in the bottom is the layers. And so you can see this looks a little different than Illustrator or Photoshop or InDesign. And that's just because it's a brand new application, so they've kind of re-engineered it. It feels a little bit more modern in my opinion. And it's really contextual. So when you click on something, this area is going to change. So in this case, we'll just start with this first storyboard. When I click on it, you can see it highlights what we're looking at there. When I zoom in, if I click on any element, then all of a sudden we get a different sort of layers view. And this is all the stuff that is on this artboard, okay? And as you can see, it's pretty ugly. And the reason is I did this in a hurry. I can't remember. This was back in December, I believe. I was in a hurry to just get out of Dodge for the holidays. So I didn't take the time to really organize this, but it's something I should have done. So I don't always listen to my own advice, but you can see now by looking at this, it's inherently a little more difficult to navigate. I'm like, well, what is screenshot that? What is mask group that? I don't exactly know. So I'm more limited in this case to having to click on each element and seeing what highlights over here. So in a perfect world, what I might have done is selected like all of this, grouped it with Command G, and I call that frame 1. Same thing here. Grab all those, group them, call that frame 2. And then I can click and drag and reorder these like that. So you sort of get the idea that Xd approaches layers a little bit differently, but still the same principles. Things that are higher up in the layer order appear above other things in the document. So with regard to type, Xd has a few different ways that you can do type. Most things are point text. So if you just take the type tool and click, you can just start typing. That somehow had a border on it, so I'm just going to uncheck that. And now that I have this selected, I can either left align it, center align it, or right align it. But because this is point text, it really doesn't change anything in Xd. Whereas in Illustrator, you would have seen that registration point jump around. So there are some like little nuanced differences that you'll find with this application. You can also convert it to different sorts of auto height and area text options. And this is for if you had more body text or a text frame, or maybe you do need it right aligned and there's other type below that would make it more clear what the alignment is. But all of these controls are largely what you would see in any of the other applications. So you have your size, I'll add another line here, just so you can see that you have leading. So we can make that larger. If you select everything and hit Command Shift left less than and greater than, those also change the font sizes, just like the other apps. So a lot of it is really similar. You can really, if you know Illustrator and InDesign, you can jump into Xd pretty quickly and start working with type. So in this document, we really are just using point type because there's no reason we don't have much. These captions are an exception here, where these are text boxes because we didn't know how much text and we wanted to be able to have it wrap. But once you have the type in there, changing colors is as simple as selecting it and just choosing a color. You can, transform the text if you want all caps. If you want to go to title case, lowercase, all of those things are also in InDesign, Illustrator, and Photoshop. Later, we'll start looking at how you can use some of the UI UX features to prototype things like lists of type, or say you have an app where you have a list of users or something and you need to stylize that. We'll start looking at some of those features later, but in the beginning here, we're just going to focus on all of the ways you add type to Xd are essentially the same as the other apps.